Welcome back to another episode of Provo Paranormal. I'm your host, Maria Rivera, and this is a podcast which focuses on eerie reports as requested and reported by other BYU students such as yourself. This week we will be sharing the history of a unique artifact discovered in the library which caught our attention. So we did the research and put in the time to help you plan a better place to study the next time you have a music theory final. You may have heard rumors of musical instruments playing themselves in the music department. We know that these rumors have so commonly been led on, they inspired Linda Denning to include them in her book, Restless Spirits, Utah's Small Town Ghosts. For this purpose, we took matters into our own hands to figure out what is going on behind the scenes of BYU's beloved musical performances. We had the chance of meeting the great-grandson of one of the university's most renowned violinists, Michael Swainston. You may have heard his work of art or seen his pieces left behind or displayed in some part of the library's records. If you haven't, you can now look out for his name while rummaging through the university's music history. While he remains famous even today, however, the man who we will focus on will be his friend. Swainston's great-grandson found records of both his great-grandfather and his great-grandfather's best friend, Adam Dunbar. Dunbar, a young prodigy, was the best violinist in his neighborhood growing up. His parents flaunted his talents and secured him scholarships since early on. Around the time that Dunbar reached age 10, he had a new neighbor move in just down the street. He was so excited when he discovered this new neighbor also played the violin. This new neighbor, as I'm sure you guessed, is in fact the Michael Swainston. The boys grew up fascinated with one another's talents, constantly learning from one another, and creating their own pieces to share. The time came that the two boys were applying to multiple different universities, certain that their talents could get them into wherever they desired to go. The summer of 1910 brought the beginning of the boys' fate with their acceptance letters. Both were accepted to Carnegie Mellon on scholarship. However, that of Dunbar only covered half tuition, while Swainston's covered full. While Dunbar's parents could afford to pay the rest of the tuition due, they were disappointed with their son's failure to perform in elite capacity, telling him he spent too much time playing with that other neighborhood boy rather than focusing on his efforts to improve his skills. This, of course, was not true. As noted by Swainston,
Adam was always practicing, even when it seemed fitting to take a break.
Surely there was some bit of bitterness in Dunbar's parents' hearts as they saw the spotlight on their son widen to include another boy in the neighborhood. Dunbar never cared too much that he wasn't the sole focus of attention when Swainston arrived, because they had become such great friends so early on that their playful competitions were always quite jubilant in his mind. The same could be said on the account of Swainston. These boys loved each other and always found great joy in their friendly competitions. Swainston was disheartened when he heard that Dunbar would not be attending Carnegie because he knew how much his friend wanted to go. Fortunately, they had applied to other universities, and while new, Brigham Young University's music department held a great rep, and both members of this friendship were accepted with scholarships that covered their entire tuition. Because it didn't matter so much to Swainston which school he went to, so much as his friend mattered to him, he turned down his opportunity to study at Carnegie and went with Dunbar to BYU. Swainston's parents weren't quite so strict as Dunbar's, and their hearts were touched when they heard their son's reasoning for making the choice that he made. Dunbar, on the other hand, was confused as to why his friend would turn down such a great opportunity, knowing that if he had the chance, he would have gone without hesitation, even if Swainston hadn't made it to go as well. Additionally, he felt slightly offended that his friend felt the need to stay by his side now while they were all grown up and had their own futures ahead of them. Essentially, he remained silent about how he felt and pushed these feelings aside, agreeing to room with his long childhood friend, and they began their studies with the same childlike demeanor as before. As the semesters passed on, they continued their playful competition, which eventually led to the rest of the student bodies and even the professors' involvement. They all were in awe of both young men's talents, but they are all in agreement that Swainston's was superior. This led to him making many new friends and receiving many invitations to go out. Dunbar was also invited to these events, but he felt it was only because these people knew he was Swainston's friend. At first, Swainston would only agree to go if Dunbar went, but after some time he agreed to go out even without his best friend. This relieved Dunbar because he never liked that Swainston's decisions depended upon him. While Swainston was out having fun, wreaking havoc, and meeting new people, Dunbar chose to stay in and devote his time alone to playing the violin. His parents had died his freshman year of college and left him with a written letter basically telling him to not disappoint them, as all good parents do. Dunbar understood his parents' approval could only come from him being the best, as the only memories he could recall of them being truly proud of him came from when he was younger, before the Swainston family had moved into the neighborhood. He tried not to think about that. He fought to convince himself that Michael's moving into the neighborhood had nothing to do with the fading of his parents' joy, but the more he tried to not think about it, the more the thought crept in. Regardless, he maintained his composure and never mentioned the thought to anyone, not even his best friend. Time continued, and their music teachers practically praised Swainston. Even when they were no longer taking their music classes together, their professor would refer to Swainston as a standard and an example for each of the students to follow. Digging the knife in deeper, his teachers would make comments to him specifically that, "Oh, you're almost as good as Swainston. Such divine hands he has. Such a gift. Perhaps with a little more practice you could be just as good as him." And on occasions, jokingly, "You just barely fall short." Of course, Dunbar was already aware of his friend's supposed superiority when it came to playing the violin, and it bothered him enough without people telling him. All he could think of when his teachers and peers spoke to him as such was the grueling memory of his parents' disappointment when he was younger. These feelings continued to rack him with torment. He told himself that they would only have one more semester, and then he would never have to be compared to Swainston again. But instead of reassuring himself, these comments drove in more frustrating fears that once they graduate, he won't be able to forget Swainston, because Swainston will move on to be a worldwide performer, and the rest of Dunbar's life will be filled with praises to his friend instead of him. The thoughts drew him mad. He lost focus in classes, his appetite grew absent, and his nights were restless. Swainston's bed was placed right across from his, and he was breathing heavily as he slept.
Ugh, he could sleep through a fire,
thought Dunbar. It really quite bothered him, until he realized what that had meant.
No,
he thought again, trying to shake off the gory temptation, but he just couldn't drop it. If Swainston just didn't wake up one day, there would be no one who played better than him. His parents would be proud that he left his mark on the school, that there was no longer someone who stood in his place. Oh, the thoughts, the lustful thoughts for glory and acceptance that ran through Dunbar's mind that night. The next few nights he continued to lie awake watching his roommate sleep so peacefully, so unsuspectingly. As the nights moved on, Dunbar began to notice how carelessly Swainston would strain his hands with the weight of his head while he slept, consistently waking with the complaint for how numb they are. Dunbar would just roll his eyes and continue on pretending he didn't realize the remark was meant to flaunt how precious his hands are. Swainston left, and Dunbar stayed in, not attending his classes that day, organizing the perfect plan. It came together just perfectly, he chuckled to himself. He set the date, the night before Swainston's next performance, right before the semester ends. He would order pizza to share and slip a Benadryl into Swainston's soda to guarantee his sleeping through the process. The clock kept ticking, but the seconds dragged on to hours. It felt like centuries, but finally entered Swainston, his distasteful, unsuspecting self floating in at 11:30 p.m. as per usual. He accepted the pizza and drank the soda, as anticipated by Dunbar, and then followed his evening routine, ever so casually, so slowly, unaware of what the night's events were to hold. It was about 1 a.m. when Swainston was sure to be knocked out. Dunbar slowly pulls the items out from under his bed that were hidden by a rather large load of laundry. He floated towards his roommate with the softest steps, placed Swainston's head to the side of his hands, gently tying the string around his wrists to add to their numbness in case the Benadryl wasn't quite strong enough. Placed the small board he borrowed from the woodworks department under Swainston's hands and gently lifted the handsaw, also borrowed from the woodworks department. He saw everything perfectly laid before him, knowing that just in a few moments the anger and hatred towards his once beloved friend would be at an end. His hands grew shaky. The air became warm and humid. Suddenly, Dunbar began to regret his decision, but instead of drawing his weapon back, he inched it forward, closer and closer, until the icy blades were right against the sleeping man's skin. Dunbar's mind replayed every comment made by his parents, neighbors, instructors, peers, everyone that had ever amplified Swainston's skills and made mention how he had fallen short. He knew it was wrong, but he knew it wasn't him that cut the first string. It was Swainston. He was the one that let the people cheer. It was him that had to show off and to take the spotlight all for himself.
Well, now you can have it.
Dunbar whispered to himself.
He will be the talk of the town, as a man with no hands.
He proceeded with the agenda, surprised at how smoothly the saw was slicing through even the bones, until finally it was done. The hands had been separated permanently from the rest of the body.
I did it,
exclaimed Dunbar.
Now I can make my parents proud. Now I can be the...
At that moment, Dunbar felt something warm and wet land on his toe. He looked down and discovered the gaping amounts of blood flow from the man's wrists to the floor. Dunbar became pale as he realized he couldn't clean the evidence in the time left. He grew worried and unsettled, confused and afraid. He thought first to return the board and the saw to their respective department. Then, with the product of his feet still gripped tightly in his own hands, he sought to bury them somewhere, but he didn't know where. Now frantic, he ran through the halls, trying to not drip any more blood as he passed a room with odd shapes on the desk. He enters and turns on the lights. Hands! Everywhere, products of plaster mold casting, as if to mock him. No, as if to applaud him. He thought this the perfect spot to hide the hands, dropping them in a bucket and turning to leave. Dunbar is convinced he's achieved his goal of the evening. In his moment of triumph, he decides to stop by the music department and play a soft tune. He approaches his violin and begins to caress the strings. He lifts his bow and starts to play. His joy is not reflected in the vibrations of the instrument. Rather, they are glum, solemn. He begins to play faster in hopes of cheering up the tune, but as the speed intensifies, so does the sadness of the violin. No matter what Dunbar tried, the violin seemed to play a song all of its own. He decided to listen to the music that played as he brushed the bow against the base of the strings. He could hear tears, as if the strings had yearned for different hands to play them. "It can't be," denied the crazy lad. "These are my strings. They couldn't possibly yearn for another's hands." But the sound grew more somber, as to mock the troubled man. The unchanging melody drew his anger back to the focus of his mind, mixed it with fear and with guilt, knowing it should have been his own hands that he chopped off, not Swainston's. The world would not have missed his hands, and no violin would mourn his ended career. The music grew louder and louder and drew him greater terror than he had ever known. He set down the violin, but it continued to play, then all the instruments together, as to perform the loss of the dearest spirit. Dunbar thought surely he was disillusioned, but the scene would not end. He stumbled around trying to find his sanity. He trips instead and falls off the stage, landing head first. He awoke the next morning, unable to feel his head or any part of his body. He looks around and sees an absence of anything except a violin. Disgusted, he refused to pick it up. Soon he heard voices chattering. He tried to call out to them, but made no sound. He searched for the door he had entered in, but all that was there was the room and the violin. He tried to beg the walls for someone to know where to find him, but instead his hands evaporated just before making contact with the wall. No, his mouth inaudibly moved. This can't be. I never died. He looked to the edge of the stage where he once lay. The realization came that he was no longer in the same world he was in just the night before. He gave in and picked up the violin with a stature of despondence. He began to play. The notes came out just as he played them, but he played how he felt, torn, betrayed, by everyone and by everything, but mostly by himself. He played, and he played as it seemed for hours, but as he was ready to set down the instruments, his hands would not let go, as if the instrument was embedded into his very palms. He discovered his fate as he had wished to be the best. Well, he was the only one, and so there was no one to be better than him. Today, the story tells that if you walk past the music department, you will still hear instruments being played by Dunbar when no one else is around. Additionally, you can find the plaster cast molds of Swainston's hands in the basement of the library. The music department had decided his hands were too treasured to not keep some kind of memory of his talents, even if they do have to be buried deep. Thanks again for tuning in our podcast this week. Please join us next Wednesday to hear another eerie experience here in Utah County.